We hold these truths so we can sell them to the highest bidder. Cloak our bad behavior and religion, then accuse the citizens of being sinners. It ought to be self-evident that we all fall short of the glory. And this is the American story, frozen. Toys and turkeys for the poor, tools and trades for the chosen. All men are created equal, yet in America, oppression has an annual sequel. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, but then unprincipled children turn the creator's theater into an octagon of ultimate fights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit. It ought to apply to the old and the youth, but we have to plant seeds of knowledge if that's what we want to produce. 1971 is the year I was born. 1972, America was torn, split on the issues of the war in Vietnam. We needed rubber trees for our cars, and Firestone could continue to grease their dirty little palms. 48 years later, I was sworn in as the first African-American county clerk of Champaign County and Illinois. But in truth, that bounty was produced from 1961 to 1972 when the youth, African-American and Caucasian, began a campaign of truth and persuasion. Now, the civil rights movement paved the way with its commitment and success. It gave the students a chance to finally understand that they had to move beyond suggest, because power concedes nothing without a demand.
It's interesting to think about the question of scale in political action. And I know a lot of folks can get discouraged because they would say, why would just my one little act make any kind of difference? I think history shows us that small steps do make a big difference, that a few folks coming together at the right time, who didn't know it was the right time, who maybe didn't even see the significance of that time till years and years later, actually ended up being an example for many other folks.
In 1971, Aaron Ammons was born and would later become the first African-American county clerk for Champaign County. During that same time, students at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign were organizing for their right to vote in Champaign County. A graduate student, Jim Young, was one of the key organizers of this movement. The intersection of Jim Young and Aaron Ammons was almost 50 years in the making.
When I learned about this important period in the 70s, what I thought of was the rise in student activism and understanding of and fluency in student power that had been here for 2 decades before. The fear of communist influence on the University of Illinois was in many ways what began a growing consciousness on campus that students might not have as much agency and power over their interaction with the university as they thought they needed. What really set a lot of the course here was something called the Claybaugh Act, where a state representative actually put some legislation in place that forbid student organizations that were involved in perceived communist sympathizing or activities to benefit from any aspect of university resources. Could not register as student organizations, could not use spaces, all these sorts of things. But it was the concern about free speech that was really the predecessor to students finding their voice here in many ways. That just got amplified when, say, local black activists encouraging some of these largely white students that were concerned about their free speech to also be looking out for the rights of their black neighbors started joining forces. So there was a lot of coalition building in the 60s especially here on campus.
At the time, it was the civil rights and black power movement as well as the anti-war movement. So you see a lot of cross-fertilization of movements. But the one constant is the role of youth and students in all of those.
Remember, these were young people in the civil rights movement. A lot of times the movements that get talked about, there's this either a misnomer or just people think that it had to be adults that was making these decisions, that were doing these things. And no, these were students, these were young people.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students.
It's Bob Moses, the civil rights activist in 1964. He led the campaign to register African American voters. It was part of a movement, really, known as Freedom Summer, that brought activists around the country to the Deep South.
When they went back to school after the summer, Mississippi Freedom Summer, and they went back to their campuses in the North, they saw that the rights that they were fighting for in the South, they didn't even have on their own campuses. Get it? And so that's what started, for instance, up in Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, the free speech movement. It's also started for many students across the country, the fight for students to have the right to vote on their own campuses.
Amidst the Vietnam War, there were many efforts and legislation being proposed to reduce the voting age from 21 to 18. Our 18-year-old men were told to fight and die in the Vietnam War, and yet they were unable to have a voice in their democracy. On July 1st, 1971, the voting age was lowered to 18. This new demographic of voters accelerated many student organizations to ensure the newly qualified voters were registered.
In '72, there was a major election coming up. There was a movement nationally in 1970 to try and get students on campuses registered to vote, because there were millions of students at that point who were not registered.
Has this building changed since you were here?
It's had a fairly major renovation in the past 5 years, but the outside is pretty much the same. I was involved starting in 1966, and then very active until '72. The Students for Environmental Concerns was a big one. Of course, the Coalition for Voter Registration was another one. When I came on the staff of the University YMCA in 1970, myself and Keith Patton started organizing. We started out, it was called the Coalition for Voter Registration, CVR. We immediately went around to a lot of student groups, both at the U of I and Parkland, and some in the community. A lot of people were immediately interested because the issues were just really getting hot. We started organizing the groups in September, and by the middle of October, we had a little over 40 groups. Yeah, so this room right over here used to be the student program office, which is where a lot of the stuff would happen. Well, I remember when we first got organized and had about 40 groups that were part of it, we used to have our meetings in Latzer Hall, which is the big hall. This room has been renovated a lot, and all the windows were replaced, chandeliers were replaced. This is also where the Friday Forum happens.
Clerk Aaron Ammons regularly speaks at the University YMCA, teaching students about their important role in democracy. In October 2023, Aaron Ammons was speaking, and Jim Young was in attendance. For the first time, Aaron and Jim's paths crossed.
There's no way I couldn't show my appreciation for those efforts of those students in the early 70s, because it ultimately resulted in me becoming the first African-American county clerk in Champaign County, and the only one of two who was elected in the entire state of Illinois in 2018. I'm Aaron Ammons, the Champaign County clerk and recorder. That means that my primary responsibility for Champaign County is to run the elections for Champaign County, also the recorder of deeds. We have various different things we do in the office, but the primary responsibility is to run the elections.
Aaron Ammons was sworn into office in 2018, but his journey began almost 2 decades prior.
I had the pleasure of studying with some of the major organizers of the civil rights movement. So in particular, my wife, Representative Carol Ammons, and I, we both spent 3.5 years studying with Reverend James Bevel up in the Chicago area as we learned the science of nonviolence and the sort of the behind the scenes and what made the civil rights movement, made it work. After spending those years studying, we would go back and forth, and we hadn't applied much to Champaign-Urbana at that time. There was an incident, a situation where Dr. Dolores Henry was the superintendent of schools of Champaign, and she was being basically pushed out or going to be terminated by the school board or the school district. We got involved, and what I could see pretty quickly, and Carol could see as well, was that our training started to come to life. And the people were listening to what we were sharing because of the clarity that we offered and our commitment. And so we worked on that campaign. Dr. Henry was ultimately terminated, but it created an opportunity for us to start organizing. We became Champaign-Urbana Citizens for Peace and Justice, and we began organizing around the elections, political education, as well as criminal justice reform.
We primarily divided up into two groups. There were two main things we were working on. One was legal action, lawsuits, and the other was demonstrations of various kinds. The first lawsuit was with the Secretary of State to try and get him to pinpoint better what the actual legal requirements were to register to vote. It wasn't clear, for example, whether a student ID card would be enough to be able to register. So the second group, by the end of October, first part of November, we were having marches over to the courthouse. We often had rallies on the quad. People marched over to register. A group of, say, a couple hundred people would march over to register. And before we won the lawsuit, virtually nobody got registered. Another time we had a bike in, so we tried to do different things just to keep the interest up. Each time that happened, there would maybe be a few that were registered, usually people that had more identification than student ID cards. Dennis Bing was still slowing that process. There was no question that he was not doing a county clerk should do everything they can to register people to vote. And the students had just won the right to register, and he was still slowing everything down.
And this would not be the last time a county clerk tried to restrict the students' access to vote. In 2018, former county clerk Gordy Holton put barriers into place that made it difficult for students to use their voice at the polls.
Sometime in December, some of the students who'd been refused were part of an additional lawsuit. The judge essentially ruled that a student ID card would be enough for a student to register to vote. And that decision finally came out while students were gone for semester break. Voter registration was very different in those days. It was not open right up until the time of an election. It closed several weeks ahead. And so when students got back, there were only, I believe it was 10 days that students would be able to register. We immediately started getting, several hundred people at a time to go over to register. What would happen essentially was that they were still moving very slowly in the courthouse. They weren't using all the registrars that they had. The League of Women Voters of Champaign County, they had volunteered to become deputy registrars. There were a number of people from the Religious Workers Association on campus who also volunteered. All of that was refused, and any idea of having registrars on campus was also refused.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Doug Quick, and we're just hours away from Election Day, and voters are already lining up at polls across central Illinois. Fox Champaign's Lauren Kostick was at one today where the line was almost an hour long. Lauren.
here at the University of Illinois actually starts down in the lobby and wraps all the way up to the 4th floor of the Illini Union. And some voters tell me they've waited more than an hour to cast their ballots. So far, about 28,000 ballots have been returned and tabulated across Champaign County. That's more than any previous midterm election here. And the University of Illinois has been the busiest early voting location so far. And at one point today, there were more than 100 people waiting in line to vote. The students I spoke with said it was worth it.
Everyone wants to vote, but like a lot of people aren't turning around because they don't, it's like their lunch break or they have class.
I think it's really important and I think it's great. I think the turnout is what it needs to be.
The students of the 70s also found their right to vote important, so they pursued legal action. However, when their efforts came up short, and with only 3 days left to register, they pursued more direct action.
We had a sit-in in the courthouse. There were probably about 20 people who sat in, including myself and Keith Patton, who was the president of the organization. And the sheriff did not arrest anybody. He said, you know, you need to leave. We didn't leave. So essentially they just pulled us out of the office. And there were probably 300 or 400 people at the courthouse at that time, students waiting in line to register. And one of the sheriff's deputies must have been a little angry that nobody was arrested. So he decided to arrest 2 of us as we were leaving the building, myself and Lou Gold, who was a political science professor.
The students' demands could not be ignored. With pressure mounting, Bing removed his restrictions.
Dennis Bing decided to remain open until the last person who was in line got registered, and that turned out to be approximately 1,400 people. There were lines around the courthouse. It was amazing. Yeah, it was great. It was really great.
The efforts of these student organizers generated action much larger than what was seen locally. It expanded to a national level and impacted changes to voter access forever.
I think voting is incredibly important. I just voted for the first time in the primaries. I'm 18, so just this year was my first time voting. And I think it's just the most important luxury that we have here in the US. Talking to my grandmother and hearing stories of my great-grandparents who, as people of color or as women, were not able to vote for so long has made me understand just how important it is to use my voice to vote for what I think is right.
Leading up to the Civil Rights Movement, there was promise upon promise for Black voter access, but very little action.
The right to vote must be open to our citizens irrespective of race and color or creed, without tax or artificial restriction of any kind. And the sooner we get to that basis of political equality, the better it'll be for the country as a whole.
I don't know exactly when she started voting, but I know that it was a gamble of whether she could or if legally she was allowed to vote. You know, all these restrictions and finding an open polling place in, Black neighborhood at the time was almost impossible.
The footstep of the march in Washington was firm, with a quiet purpose and a mannerly rhythm. It aroused, even in dissenters, a larger awareness of the right of the Negroes as Americans to share equally not only the sun and air so clear and free on the day of their march, but their right as Americans to share opportunity and privilege as well.
I would simply like to say that I think this has been one of the great days of America. And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
The U.S. is reminded it is not enough to hope together, to pray together. She is reminded she must speak and act for the common good.
We passed a law back there in 57 and said that first time in 85 years everybody's going to have a chance to vote. And we said it again in 60. And we said it again in 64, and then by God, it still hadn't been executed. And we're going to say it again in the convention in 64.
Because of the persistence of organizers, African American voters had a voice and used it. After decades of promises, finally, African Americans were given the right to vote and have the opportunity to be an elected official.
The rights to vote has moved beyond rights to vote to the responsibility to vote. I would add one little caveat to responsibility, though, the word critical, in all senses of the term, critical. It's critical that you take responsibility, but it's also one must be critical in your use of it. This notion of the critical responsibility to use the right to vote was the same thing that Black Power advocates like myself had to face. We elected Black political leaders, Black mayors, Black state representatives, ultimately Black senators, and even we finally checked off the box that's been on, on the historical agenda for Black people forever, a Black president. Does that critical responsibility of young people to vote mean that they have to step up and become the ones they want to vote for?
I was working as a custodian, as a building service worker at the University of Illinois during most of this time. I worked there for about 17 years. We would always run into, for the most part, we would run into elected officials who would not carry forth our ideas. So we decided that we would run for those offices.
The county board election was one of the main elections other than the primary. We had made up a list of 6 different issues that we wanted to see who would support those issues. The Democrats were willing to support all of the 6 issues that we were interested in, so they were endorsed.
My name is Laurel Pressing. I got asked in the 1970s to run for county board.
It was really the first time that students had been able to vote locally, and in any numbers anyway. And in the case of that county board election, all 9 of the Democrats in those 3 districts where a lot of students registered won. And I believe in 2 of the districts, the new votes made the difference.
I always say every vote counts, and I have a real good example of it that I won my first election by 1 vote.
Laura Pressing was one of 3 women elected to the Champaign County Board. Prior to this time, no woman had ever been elected into this office. She would continue her work in politics as a state representative and eventually mayor of Urbana. During her time as mayor, Laurel intersected with then local organizer Aaron Ammons.
I don't know how I got to know him. I think it was a neighborhood group. So it seems like he had a talent for helping people solve problems. So that's why I suggested that he go on into politics.
Laura was mayor at the time that my wife was elected and moved on to state representative. And Laura Pressing said, hey, if Aaron Ammons was to run for this seat, no one would beat him. He would win the seat. And for Ward 3, I would like to appoint him. At that time, I was still dealing with and had a felony conviction on my record. So I was not legally allowed to serve as an elected official at the municipal level. County government then and now allows a person with a felony conviction to serve, but at the municipal level, I could not.
He had a record as a young man, and I don't think that somebody who makes a mistake when they're a teenager should have to pay for it for the rest of their life.
At that time, Governor Pat Quinn was up for re-election. Unfortunately, Governor Quinn did not win, but the governor has the right to pardon. Well, Laura Pressing and Governor Quinn had a close relationship, and she also reached out to him and said, hey, Aaron has done the work, and he would be able to serve on the Urbana City Council if you were to give him the pardon. And on the way out, I think I was the last name on the list, he pardoned me and lifted my felony conviction, which allowed me to serve. So that's kind of how I got pulled into this.
Aaron Ammons ran for and won county clerk in 2018, becoming the first Democrat in 76 years to hold that position. His victory was due in part to the student vote that the former clerk tried to restrict. The students' passion for exercising their right to vote was the same passion that led the students of the 70s to fight for and win the right to vote.
In the early 70s, there was just almost total opposition to students being able to register. Today, with Aaron Ammons being the county clerk, it's much more open. There'll be much more attempts to get everybody registered who wants to register.
I've watched people work here and be adamant that the students shouldn't have the right to vote where they go to school. Let them vote back where their home is or something, they say. Yet they don't take the same position for the snowbird who lives for 6 months in Florida and only 6 months here. Being in this office has taught me how voting rights and taxes come together. The whole idea of taxation without representation really comes to life for me now as the county clerk, and understanding elected officials are sort of parsing out and divvying up your resources, your tax dollars. Your property taxes, your income taxes, your sales taxes, all of these, your motor fuel taxes. These are the taxes that create the pool of money that pay for our schools and firefighters and police officers and our armed forces, right? That's where this money is coming from. It's coming from the people. And if you don't vote, then you put your money in the pool and walk away and let some people decide what to do with your resources. And that's contrary to the way this government and the way this country was set up.
There are not that many people on this planet that have the opportunities that we do of self-government, and to, I think, just appreciate the fact that you have this ability. You need to act.
I go around to the high schools and even the elementary schools to teach the students about the importance of voting and how to vote. I do think it's necessary for our educational system to start earlier in pre-K and kindergarten, teaching, I'm just a bill, sitting here on Capitol Hill.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well,
understanding how government works at an early age, so that when you become of age to vote or to run for office, when you see a city budget, it won't be the first time you've ever seen it in your life. So I do think we need further education about how government works.
We are in some interesting moments in terms of the history of higher education. There are folks that still see higher education as a time of formation and a time to actually immerse yourself in a sort of mini version of what larger civic life is going to be. And so they get involved in student government, they get involved in organizations on campus, and they start to see, oh, I get to use the rightly more cloistered time of being a student to kind of try out some things, learn how to be a citizen.
So there's a lot of voting at universities, and students have that experience of voting. But when the student body organizations vote to, say, divest and whatnot, and then they're shut down by the administration.
We are asking for the divestment from all corporations and academic collaboration.
Protesters wanted the university to divest from companies that are profiting off the Israel-Hamas war. They say that didn't happen.
If your vote is so easily marginalized, I mean, just in the university context, you're denied voting rights. And so you get blowback from you young people. Why should we, what do we have to vote for?
It makes me feel good that students are still active. It just means that they're keeping up with what's going on in the world, and they're still interested, still involved, and like I say, this is an important issue. In some ways, it makes me feel like there hasn't been all that much progress. And Of course, in some ways, some issues there have been, and other issues there hasn't been.
From the sea to the river.
The persistence with which we use the right to vote can always be tested. On June 24, 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. What was once federal law went back to the states, and there was nothing the people could do to stop this ruling.
The loss of the right and all of the ramifications of that loss, having to do with bodily autonomy, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, one could reason that the right to vote really didn't make a difference if it was the Supreme Court that can essentially, negate or abolish what was won. That's on the one hand that people could say, well, what did the right to vote mean if the Supreme Court can nullify? The other side of it is the right to vote and the responsibility to vote is the only thing that's going to then push back against Dobbs. And so there is that critical use of the right. It isn't just the right anymore, it's the responsibility.
It's becoming clearer now that the argument around states' rights is a very potent argument. We're watching now as the federal government relaxes the Voting Rights Act, or the Supreme Court now is dominated by Republicans, that some of the voting rights and the access that we were used to and the safeguards are being rolled back. And so states' rights are becoming much more of an issue.
I'm scared for the inevitable. My attitude is shared by a lot of people of my generation that we know politics is getting really extreme and there's nothing that we can really do about it. I think that voting is just voting for the best option. And I think that if we continue to vote for the best option, I think that things might get better. And I think that's why it's so important, because one terrible candidate or one terrible presidency can just completely mess up the world for a while. And we don't really have that kind of time.
Our vote matters, and exercising our rights and our voice gives we the people the power for change.
There's all kinds of levels of government, and it's harder to get things done at the national level, but it's not so hard to get stuff done at the local level because city councils respond to the public. Local government really, they have a job to do, and they do it. And I think most local governments do a good job. And if they don't, they'll get tossed out by the voters.
I think that a lot of people forget about the down ballot candidates. Obviously, we have our presidential candidates, we have senators, you also have congressmen, you have state representatives. There are so many people that are shaping our lives in ways that we sometimes forget about, but in ways that often impact us more than anything the presidential candidate would be doing. And those races are really tight, and your vote matters even more there because it's drawing from a smaller group of voters.
It's important that elected officials do the work that the people sent you there to do. And that was one of the things that the civil rights movement was banking on, that the right to vote would then give you the right to choose leadership who cared about the things that affected you and your values.
Believing that your vote really matters on the national level requires a lot of faith in the system. And right now what we're seeing is a decrease in the amount of faith that young people have in the system. There are other students that also find the right to vote to be very important. But I also think that since we're younger, we haven't experienced as many elections, so it's harder to understand the weight of that since I haven't ever voted in a presidential election before. Students are very familiar with protesting, Throughout the past 5 years or so, as I've been in high school and in college, I've participated in and witnessed a lot of peaceful protests for a really wide range of causes, because that is a way that young people can make sure that their voices are heard. I think that when you're protesting, you have a very firm idea of what you want to achieve, and you're trying to push a politician or someone in power to believe that also and to exert their power to help your cause. Whereas when you're voting, you don't necessarily have the luxury of having the perfect candidate all the time. I think it's almost a compromise, which I think is really hard for a lot of people.
I think that especially young people who are active within these protests find it hard to compromise because they find success in some areas when they're able to just speak their mind and get exactly what they want out there into the world. Whether or not that comes back and they receive everything they want, they're at least able to speak their voice and be heard in exactly the way they're feeling. And so compromise is really hard. Casting a vote is not saying that you 100% agree with a candidate. Casting a vote is choosing one over another. And choosing neither is choosing the other. For the most part, I don't think that students or young people recognize how important their vote is. I think that as a student, voting is voting in yourself. Students and young people in particular are the generation of the future. So their voting is an investment into what they want their life to be in a few decades.
In the 70s, you can see how the publicity, the organizing, the getting the issues out there definitely made a difference. When that doesn't happen, then people just aren't as aware. They're not aware of what the issues are. It's really important, again, just to find what issues are important to people, then to get them organized, to spread the word about whatever issues are the most important, because that's going to help to turn people out to vote.
My hope is that the organizing efforts and the political education will go beyond just registering and going to go vote blindly Democratic or blindly Republican. I think we have to have educated, informed voters to make sure that you spend some time finding out who the individual is that's running for office. And that if money and party machines continue to drive the electorate instead of the electorate driving the outcome and driving those parties, that's a dangerous space to be in, because the people start to feel like that the election process is either untrustworthy or not producing any results for them or not changing their lives in the way that it should be changed. And I think that will lead to mass civil unrest. So keeping our elections intact and making sure people have a way to exercise their opinions and their voice and to make sure their votes are counted and that they can trust that process, I think it's critical to keeping America as a country.
I think that there's very little knowledge from most students about how fragile their right to vote is or how recent it is.
I have a lot of respect for the people that advocated so hard to earn student voting rights for me and people like me. The right to vote in itself is incredibly important, and so many people have sacrificed so much historically in this country to earn that right to vote, both in general and specifically for students. So, I mean, I would say thank you, because without them doing that work, I wouldn't be able to go to the polls in November.
I would say thank you. It's pretty simple, but I would thank them for doing such a good job at securing my right to vote that I don't think about it. It gives me some hope that things will eventually happen. It kind of tells me that maybe we do just need more time, and that in 50 years the world might be a totally different place, and we again might not even have to think about or worry about these problems that we're facing every single day.
I actually wasn't raised as someone who was encouraged to vote. I came up in a household where there was some real skepticism about the effectiveness of voting and whether or not investing that way in one's country instead of in one's church or one's family was really worth doing. And I became a real convert, really, as I came through my student years. I think the way I became a convert was seeing that my vote matters not only for how it influences an outcome, but for how it changes my relationship to my state, to my community. It makes me different. I come from art, I come from painting. When you make a painting, when you make a drawing, there are so many marks you put on that page, on that canvas, that you never see again because they're buried under there. They're underneath the paint. You erase them later, you change them, but you had to make them to get to the final picture. And that's true of every good painting and picture. There are countless marks in that you don't see that had to be there. And that's how I look at voting. It changes who I am as the painter, every brush stroke I make, and it changes who I am as a citizen, every vote I take, even if it's not making an outcome that I can point to in some instrumental way.
Change